But anyway, thank you so much for being here. My name is Megan Wright, and I am the Director of Industry Relations for MasLabor, and we are the nation's largest H-2 services provider. So we help folks navigate both the H-2A and H-2B programs, as well as a few other visa classes. But we are just so excited to have been here with you this week, and then specifically to be able to support the FBN members. And so today, what I am going to do, is keeping in mind we do only have 30 minutes, is definitely leave time for questions at the end. And so just a very quick show of hands though, does anybody currently use the H-2A program? Okay. And then anybody thinking of using the program within the next year or so? Okay, I know who I'm gonna pick on later. All right. Well, for those of you who do currently participate in the program, hopefully you'll learn a little something new today. This is taking a bit of a step back. So really what your business needs to know while you are considering the H-2A program, but even if you're already in the midst of it, maybe there's something from a compliance perspective you haven't thought about before, so making sure that we take a deeper dive there. So we are certainly going to go over some of the program basics, essentially who is eligible, what do you need to keep in mind, and what are some of the largest requirements by way of being an H-2A employer, kind of those big ticket monetary items, and then of course some of the compliance-based pieces as well. We are going to go through the filing process and timeline, definitely not to scare you, but to really just educate you on what is involved, which is why we gave you that handout, because I am just going to give you the timeline there, not necessarily what is in each step. And then, of course, we're going to go through some potential solutions. So how would this actually apply to your operation? We'll talk through some common nuances, again, within those program eligibility requirements. And then we're going to talk about some current events, which I revamped for today specifically. So really, what are the H-2 programs? So back in 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act actually created the H-2 visa class. Fast forward, in '86, it was split into the two programs that we have today, H-2A for agricultural temporary seasonal work, and H-2B for non-agricultural. I think keeping in mind, again, that this is a non-immigrant seasonal temporary worker visa program. We have only since '86 seen two new program rules. So in 2010, we have what's called the Obama rule, where they made some updates and adjustments. And then just recently, we have the Biden rule, which is under a little bit of scrutiny for not necessarily following the administrative process, because Trump tried to release one in 2019, didn't end up coming through, so now Biden is taking over. But ultimately, since '86, really we've only seen two updates, if you will. So that's why this program is very tricky to follow, maybe not necessarily the most up-to-date for how our operations work. And so that's why it's important to really make sure that you understand all of those requirements. So again, this seems silly, but what is agriculture in the terms of the program? So you need to make sure that you are satisfying either the Fair Labor Standards Act definition or, oddly enough, the Internal Revenue Code definition, which we will see how that might play out in one of our scenarios. But essentially, primary agriculture is what we probably think of. That is your field preparation, as you're planting, you're cultivating. That means that you are the grower, you are the farmer. But then secondary agriculture comes in too. So this is what may be performed on the farm that is either incident to or in conjunction with your growing operation. So maybe you have a packing or a processing house on your property. Maybe you need to actually, once you grow your commodity, you need to get it to market. So maybe you need a CDL driver. So different ways of thinking through that agriculture. And then of course, as we discussed with H-2B, really anything that is non-agriculture then falls into that other sister program. So I keep saying temporary or seasonal. There's some interesting kind of key notes in those definitions. So seasonal for the term of the program really means that it's tied to a certain time of year, so that's recurring, tied to an event or pattern, aka your growing season, Or let's say you have a year-round operation, but you have these labor needs that are far and above your ongoing operations that again happen seasonally. Temporary would mean that maybe you have a one-time need, or of course that it's just less than a year. And even though it doesn't explicitly say this, Department of Labor won't certify any contract periods longer than 10 months. So as you all have stopped by the booth to talk about this, your absolute maximum timeline per occupation and per geography is 10 months. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean there in a second, but I want to keep moving. So we're going to go through some of the basic requirements. Again, these are the big ticket items, the monetary items, or some of the biggest compliance-based things that you need to keep in mind. Number one, U.S. recruitment, which we all know that I don't think anybody would be considering a highly regulated federal program if you had a long line of qualified U.S. workers begging to come do these jobs, but still have to play by the rules. So ultimately here, positive recruitment means, and we'll walk through when this starts, but essentially as soon as the state and then subsequently Department of Labor accept your job order, that is opening up your period of U.S. recruitment. So that means anybody who is sent your way from a referral standpoint, you absolutely have to interview, and then if that individual fits the bill, meaning that they are qualified, they have your minimum skill requirements, they are able, willing, and available, agreeing to the terms of the H-2A contract, you do have to hire them, and in most cases, as you see there, all the way through the 50% point of your contract. So let's say your season is April through December, somebody shows up at the end of June, they're like, I want this job. You would still have to hire them if they fit the bill because you are not yet through to the 50% point of your contract period. And then also too, keeping in mind that if anybody worked with you in the previous year and they are in good standing, meaning that they did not get terminated for cause, you do have to invite them to apply for this H-2A rule. Corresponding employment is huge. We're going to talk about wages in I believe, the next slide. But this is, I think, becoming one of the biggest tripping points within the program, what is really making this kind of reach into all corners of your operation. Essentially, we can't discriminate against U.S. workers or domestic workers by participating in the H-2A program. Most, 99% of the time, that comes down to wage rate, meaning that if you have a U.S. worker that is sharing any of the same job duties as your H-2A job order, they need to be making at least that designated wage rate. However, that also comes with any other of the benefits of the H-2A program. So when we talk about housing, that also comes down to what's called your area of intended employment. So through the referral process, if somebody comes to you out of state and they're just dying to work for you, you would then have to extend all of the terms of those H-2A contract, including housing, transportation, whatever it may be. So corresponding employment really needs to be taken seriously in conjunction with, again, what is your area of intended employment on your H-2A application, which is why you see here our best practice. We like to follow the Goldilocks principle. Of course, we want this program to be as beneficial and as efficient for your operation as possible. So we want these H-2A workers to do as much on your farm as they can, but at the same time, let's be smart. Maybe we do actually need to separate job duties based on who is currently working. Maybe you have high schoolers that love to come help you in the summer, but they're certainly not as productive. We don't want to pay them the $17.33 an hour for your state. Maybe you need to be smart about your job description so that way you're not inadvertently looping everybody in. So here's the wages. Employers must pay the highest of these four categories. 99% of the time, the highest is going to be that A word. It stands for adverse effect wage rate. And this is an aggregate of your state's agricultural job duties, usually coming from the USDA Farm Labor Survey, which is a bit of a flawed system, but we don't have time to get into that right now. But ultimately, again, that is the wage rate currently is dictated by your state through this program. Something to keep in mind is that there is the potential of a new wage rule potentially dropping. They've been threatening us with it for about 2 years, so we're not sure when that's going to happen. But right now, keeping in mind that the AWR is an aggregate, meaning that it doesn't matter what they are doing for you, that is a flat hourly rate that they would be paid. I have some examples there. When I say proposed, that means that the USDA Farm Labor Survey was just released, but Department of Labor hasn't actually published that yet. But again, about vast majority of the time, they just take that and run with it there. So you can see from the lowest, 22 to 23, how big of a jump it was, and then even from the highest, 22 to 23, what we're starting to deal with. Housing, again, is something that in this day and age, as the housing market gets tighter and tighter, it's becoming a pretty large barrier of entry in and of itself. Certainly, you need to provide housing free of charge to any non-local worker. So again, back to that corresponding employment. If you have somebody that is applying to your job outside of your area of intended employment, they may require housing. And so again, non-local is the key here. But again, majority of the time that is going to be your H-2A workers. Your state is going to inspect this housing, and again, it has to be free of charge. So you'll see there our best practice, of course, is making sure that we're thinking about this really first thing when you're considering the program to make sure you have a viable option. Travel too is kind of the next most all-encompassing requirement of the program. So you are required to pay both inbound and outbound transportation by way of least cost common carrier, aka the most efficient way of getting them to you. Number two, you need to make sure that you are reimbursing said travel, if not paying it in advance. And then, of course, when they are on site, you are also providing daily transportation from wherever that free housing is to their work site, and then into town at least once a week for groceries, banking, laundry, that sort of thing. What we have here for best practice is that the program actually dictates that you just have to reimburse them by the 50% point of the contract. However, if these workers have paid out of pocket, that gets considered a deduction within their first weeks of payroll. And if you deduct the expenses that they paid on travel and then divide out the hours they've worked, if they fall below FLSA minimum wage, you are not in compliance. So therefore, we recommend, if possible, to please pay these workers really within that first week so you don't have to go through all of those equations there to make sure you're in compliance. Prohibited fees, always unlawful to solicit or receive any fees from workers directly or indirectly. So what I think is what can be the most heartbreaking piece of this program is that if a worker inadvertently in their home country pays to get on what they consider a list, or maybe they have someone in their community that says, I'll get you, on an H-2A contract. All you have to do is, pay me $500. Unfortunately, that renders everyone involved ineligible for the program. So I think it's also really important to continue, even if you participate in the program, to please educate your workers that this is certainly unlawful. Folks are really starting to pay attention to this in Homeland Security, and it will bar everyone involved from the program. Just other items here to keep in mind. Again, the employer also has to pay all visa-related costs. And so right now, the machine-readable visa is still $190. This is, again, back to housing, something that I always bring up with folks considering the program. If you need to get creative in what your housing solution is, just make sure kitchen facilities pass muster. If they do not, let's say you have to go to just a traditional hotel or a motel as your housing solution, and it does not have a kitchen, you as an employer then actually have to physically furnish 3 square meals a day. That's not handing them a debit card saying have fun. That is literally giving them a meal that meets caloric intake requirements. You are able to deduct a very small per diem, $14 a day per person. That certainly wouldn't offset the cost of catering 3 meals a day for your workers. And then, as I mentioned on that transportation side, providing that to them as well. So keeping an eye here on the time. This is the filing timeline and process that you have in front of you. It is for us best practice to really start thinking about this at least 120 days in advance. There are a lot of, again, nuances within the program. If you need to consider, are you going to try and do this in-house? Are you going to enlist the help of an agent or attorney? Really making sure that you are understanding all of these key pieces, which is why we recommend, even though the beauty of the H-2A program is that your start date is based off of your true operational need, that you have enough foresight that you start this process at least 120 days in advance. I should not say we, you, if you're filing on your own, or your agent or your attorney, would start this filing process 75 days in advance of your ideal worker arrival. You technically have between days 75 and 60 to start that process with the SWA, but certainly we want to give everybody involved with our friends in the government as long of a runway as possible. So really starting on that day 75. Then subsequently you move to Department of Labor, onwards to CIS, and then Department of State for the consular appointments. And then of course, hopefully, they are arriving on your designated start date and they can get to work. So just very quickly, all of this information is in front of you, but what are you filing with the state? Your ETA 790. Again, when are we saying to file this? I would say as close to that day 75 as possible, knowing it can't be any earlier than that. But we have found that absolutely, statistically speaking, especially if you check out all of the DOL disclosure data, if you try and file after that 65th day, get that process started with the state, it really has a strong correlation to late worker arrival. And of course, you are doing this on the SWA's Foreign Labor Program Coordinator. And this, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this opens your intra-state recruitment requirements. So again, starting then when the state posts your job, you must start to be willing to recruit any of those U.S. applicants that are sent your way. Department of Labor then, as I mentioned, it can't be any later than 45 days prior to your start date, but really you can just get that started as soon as you get your acceptance from the SWA. You are doing this online via the FLAG system. Then this in turn opens your interstate U.S. recruitment. So again, the Department of Labor is going to be posting this job on seasonaljobs.gov. If you happen to get somebody, again, who wants to join your operation from out of state, this is why, because this is where it's being posted. I would say if you are a first-time program user, there is a small carve-out for a shorter filing timeline. As you see here, no later than 45 days to get started with Department of Labor. But in this case, you could file what is called an emergency filing, which means that you are actually filing simultaneously with the state and Department of Labor at that 45-day mark, just in case you need to move a little bit more quickly. Again, probably a stronger likelihood of a slightly late worker arrival, but at least if you need that option, you have that available to you. So again, reserved for first-time program users or folks who at least have not used the program within the past year. Next, you are moving forward with CIS. Again, doing this right after you get your Department of Labor certification. This is actually a paper filing. Afterwards, I can tell you a funny story about why they still want all of these filings on paper and why they'll probably continue to do so in the future. But ultimately, CIS is validating all of your business information and again, confirming all of your program eligibility. And then what we find to be best practice here at the very bottom is that most H-2A petitions are what are called unnamed petitions. Even if you know who you would like to bring, potentially you are working alongside a worker facilitator who is helping to recruit and screen these workers, still your petition should be unnamed, meaning that if something were to happen, maybe their circumstances change, maybe they can't come, those individuals are not yet tied to that particular visa slot, which would then set you back quite a bit if you needed to reopen and recertify. Then, of course, you are taking these workers where they are getting an appointment at the U.S. consulate to actually get their visa. And really here, just best practice, what we always like to address is this can be a very daunting experience. You know, make sure that if you are not using a worker facilitator, that these workers know how to navigate this process on their own, if not enlisting the support of a reputable worker facilitator. So now that we have gone through all of the dry information, I wanted to try and take a couple of minutes and walk through some specific scenarios. So scenario number one, maybe you are a grain or a row crop farm in Nebraska and you need help really with just kind of that full spectrum planting. Then we're going to be doing some harvesting. I need them to be doing some maintenance on the farm. I need them to be able to drive a combine, maybe have some irrigation experience, general maintenance. Who's coming? I think In this environment specifically, we've heard a lot of folks bringing workers from South Africa. So for example, maybe you need to have someone come that has a very technical experience, that knows how to drive a combine, that does speak English. This could be a perfect opportunity for a worker, again, from South Africa, where their agricultural technology mirrors ours a little bit more closely. They would be coming, again, they'd be able to do anything in support of or incident to your farming operation. This is where I have the asterisk, however, one of those nuances that I referred to. I have self-harvest there. So are these workers working for you on land that you own, lease, or control? By control, I mean from a management perspective, like you would bring in a management company to handle the entire growing process. If it is not one of those three items, maybe you do some custom work on third-party growing sites. Custom combining, literally just a combine machine, does have a special procedures carve-out. Must have had some good lobbyists back in the day. And so that would be a special procedure filing process, so a little bit more intricate, slightly different. But that allows you to be able to take these workers to those third-party sites by filing in that specific manner. Let's say, however, that you do custom spraying, or maybe you do some custom baling on somebody's property. It literally has to be the combine machine to have that carve out. So if you do additional work on third-party sites, that actually makes you in turn a farm labor contractor, which has a lot more requirements on top of what we even have gone through. You need a special license. That license takes at least 15 weeks to obtain. It is free, but it is a highly backlogged program. There are bonding certificates that you have to get, surety bonds to protect you against those contracts. It is very, very different. So again, even though you think, well, this certainly is primary agriculture, I'm definitely going to qualify, well, let's make sure we think about your operation in particular. Are you going to maybe want to reserve the right to be able to take these folks to third-party sites? So again, definitely needing to think that through. Another scenario, maybe you are a free-range or pastured poultry operation in California. You need just help with all chicken care and farm maintenance. So maybe you need some tractor driving. Maybe you actually need to build a new coop. So I would love some basic construction skills. You know, who comes? Maybe this is a skilled worker out of Guatemala where they have some animal care experience, they know how to drive a tractor, they are going to be able to help you build that chicken coop. Again, perfect opportunity to be able to have this worker come to your farm and be able to help you in all of those different aspects. The asterisk on this slide. Is it free range or pastured? I know I said process. I'm going to get to that second example in a minute. Unfortunately, a lot of livestock, whether it's a dairy operation or whether it is more of a traditional large-scale poultry operation, that does not have a seasonality component to it, at least not in Department of Labor's eyes. So we really need, the reason I said pastured or free range is because we're going to need to show that seasonality in your temporary need statement when we're making that argument. So a traditional egg operation may not qualify, whereas if you are free range or pastured and you have the movement of the chickens, you have the seasonality component, that would be fine. And then here, the specific asterisk that I wanted to bring up too is, do you process chickens? Well, unfortunately, processing is out of the scope of the H-2A program. That is because although they can do anything in support of or incident to your growing operation, that is also up to the first point of sale and or as long as the commodity is in its unmanufactured state. So chicken still needs to be a clucking chicken. It cannot be processed in any way. So the line in the sand here absolutely stops as soon as you would want to process that animal. So keeping that in mind too. So unfortunately, even though it would be so easy to just continue that H-2A workers help into a processing capacity, it is not permissible in the program. Lastly here, maybe you are a diversified fruit orchard in Virginia. You need help in the beginning of your season with pruning. Maybe you're expanding your acreage. You need someone to help plant. You all do hand harvest. You don't use machinery. We need some cleaning and packing. All of those different job duties for a very full season. You definitely need some ag equipment operation. You need someone who knows how to hand prune. Maybe you definitely need someone who can go up and down a ladder and lift at least 75 pounds. So who comes here? Maybe this is a perfect opportunity for a worker from Mexico. They have this agricultural experience. They absolutely have equipment operation experience, and they certainly have hand pruned before. So that, again, a perfect opportunity to bring someone, let's say, from Mexico. This particular asterisk here, what we need to think about. I'm going to go second one first. You are bringing these folks to also help with the packing house. Does your operation help pack your neighbor's apples? Do you have a packing and processing house on site that helps growers across your state? Well, does this packing house cross that initial IRC definition of working with at least the simple majority of your product? So in this case, in order to have H-2A workers in the packing house, it needs to be at least 51% your apples. And then coupled with, if you've crossed that threshold, fantastic. However, if it is outside product, it is no longer deemed agricultural in nature by the Department of Labor. So in that sense, your ag exemption goes out the window. So any time that those workers would handle that outside product, even though it's in the minority, they would be paid overtime immediately for any hours in excess of 40. So again, really needing to make sure you've thought through your operation holistically. What did I just say about your commodity needing to be in its unmanufactured state? Well, again, thanks to lobbyists a couple of decades ago, cider pressing has its own specific carve-out. So if you actually happen to need folks to do cider pressing on your farm, and again, it's non-alcoholic, they can continue to work in that specific capacity. So I did just get my 5-minute warning, so I want to save a couple of minutes for questions. And as I mentioned, I had a pretty in-the-weeds slide here for current events. We recently had that new program rule that I mentioned is now has had an injunction filed against it, 594 pages worth. But I thought this was so interesting what we learned from Peter last night. You know, how is our labor market going to evolve in the next 20 years? Sounds like there's going to be quite a gap. If we're already feeling this gap right now, what is going to continue to happen? And so we did have somebody mention a question about immigration, and that was something that he said that he does not think is going to fix, because we certainly know our friends in DC are going to argue back and forth about that quite a bit. But what about H-2A? This is a non-immigrant seasonal worker visa program. You know, is this something where if this is going to be, a when and not an if, but, do we need to start seeing how we can handle this program now? Do we want to start bringing in 1 or 2 workers to see how they fit into your operation now? Do we kind of need to build the muscle for this program over time? Potentially. And so it'll be really interesting to see how this program continues to evolve, what happens out of DC, and also how to be smart and make sure that your operation is getting used to this potential solution before it becomes an absolute necessity. So I thought that was a very interesting correlation last night. I know Edward and I wanted to sort of stand up and scream, well, H-2A is a perfect solution, but anyway, just food for thought there. So I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and so I definitely wanted to save just a little bit of time for questions. I know that was some pretty dense information, but is there anything operation specific that I can answer for anyone? Maybe you, again, currently use the program, thought of something new, have some questions, or I might have to pick on my folks who might be considering the program soon to tell us about your operation. Really anything that I can answer right now, please. Yes, sir.
Those rules that Biden administration were putting in, what would those be?
So there are quite a few. Again, as I mentioned, it's 594 pages. I'd be happy to send over to you if you want to leave us your email, sort of our interpretation of that. The good was kind of a meh, mostly what we call the bad and ugly. For someone who is what's considered a fixed site grower, I think the biggest change was that joint employment is no longer a viable option for a lot of folks. Joint employment meant maybe you have a neighbor grower where you both want to share the expense of the program. Maybe you have housing, but you want to handle the payroll. It really was a great solution. Now joint employment is reserved only for part-time work, meaning anyone on the application cannot go over 34 hours. I think the biggest thing that we're going to see that was part of the injunction, the National Council of Agricultural Employers is the entity suing, and that is because for FLCs, those farm labor contractors, they did an insane increase in those surety bonding amounts, making those bonding requirements go from 2 years to 3 years, the percentage of that going through the roof. So we're really trying to fight on behalf of farm labor contractors, a few other things. But ultimately right now it went into play on November 12th. If you are filing with a start date of February 8th or later, that means that you are going to be technically right now under the new program rule unless it gets rolled back. So I can definitely follow up with you after to see your operation and how it might affect you. Any other questions?
Okay, what about, like, can you kind of pick your age of a person you want, or like a man, wife, and all that good stuff?
It's a great question. So
no one under 30, or I don't know. Did I say that out loud?
So the answer to that question, certainly if that U.S. referral is coming to you, no discrimination. Obviously, all of our rules apply. When you, let's say, would be working through a worker facilitator, you as an employer do get final hiring decision, and so you would absolutely be able to quite frankly choose who might be the best fit for your operation. So yes, that is completely up to you. So that's a great question. But again, if a U.S. referral comes to you, definitely no discrimination there. Yes, sir.
Or a month, or how is that?
Yeah, really great question. So essentially by participating in the program, we've already said it's a temporary/seasonal program. However, it still needs to be considered full-time. Full-time for the program is 35 hours. However, you actually work towards a contract-long set of minimum hours. So what gets put onto the job order itself is 75% of your total hours. So when you go through the application process, you choose an average work week within 20% up or down. That gets multiplied by the number of weeks in your contract, and then 75% of that is taken. It's called the 3/4 guarantee. So you're actually just slowly chipping away at that over your contract period. So maybe it rains for a week straight and they only work, 28 hours. Well, that's fine. Next week they're harvesting and they're going to work 65. So it just evens itself out. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So that is based on your state. So this is a federal program, but you still have. He's flashing at me. You still have to abide by state, and then even in some cases local regulations. So it's based on your state. If you have full ag exemption, for example, Minnesota is now all the way down to 48 hours. So you would be able to go 48 hours before paying time and a half. But if your state doesn't have anything, and I'd be happy to check, it would just be no overtime. All right, well, thank you so much. I will be either sticking around here or our booth. I will still be at the booth all afternoon. If you have any specific operation questions, I'd be very happy to answer those. And thank you so much.